Eric, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So this has been a long time in the making. I know we talked about doing this for quite a while. I'm actually grateful that we've been able to do this in person. So to kick things off, I'm curious and this is kind of a very broad question, but today you're the managing partner at Chaffin Luhana, very well-respected firm just nationally. But before we get to all that, I know we'll talk about that. I want to speak to if there's any experiences in your childhood or that may have shaped you into the person you are today.
If you'd asked me that a few years ago, I probably would have said the things I typically say publicly, which is, I had a really hardworking father who's a steel worker. He's also a construction worker, just someone who's phenomenally good with his hands. And so he's very entrepreneurial, always kind of working things on the side, doing different things, and pretty much a workaholic. So I learned my drive and work ethic from him. And then, of course, juxtapose that to my mom, who is, the quintessential traditional homemaker, who was just such a lovely person, very caring and compassionate. They married as teenagers, and so I pretty much grew up with them. And so that pretty much, for the longest time, that's what I publicly say about what formed me as a person. I think more recently, what I would say is age 5, I was sexually abused. It's something I hadn't actually really come to terms with or even talk about until the last few years. And so that probably impacted me and shaped my life a lot more than I knew until I really worked through that and understood how it impacted my life positively. Because frankly, with the statistics around people that face that kind of trauma, oftentimes they end up in a much different position. I think could have produced a different Eric than it did. And I feel actually blessed and fortunate that I am where I am. So.
And how would you say it impacted your life positively?
When I first started working through my trauma, I started January 2015. I started meditating January 8th, 2015. And I think within the first year of that, I really started coming to terms with things that were coming up for me, whether it's anger or different issues, like even sitting down on a podcast with a guy, like I would actually have issues on my team. Most of our team members for the longest time were female. There was very few men in my firm. And I think it's just things that were coming up for me. And so that's the negative part of it. The positive side of it is that I, from a very early age, understood what it meant to not have a voice. I knew what it meant to not feel like you could go to someone and seek help and get help from others. And so I took those feelings and I really turned them into a drive to go help others. And so it's what motivated me to go to law school. It's what motivated me to be a federal prosecutor. It pushed me to be my very best at times so I could be the best I could for my clients, for the government, for the victims of the government I represented. And so it really defined my sense of justice in this world and really what my firm's about today.
And is it true that you were the first or among the first in your family to go to college?
Yeah, first to go to college and almost didn't make it there. I remember I went to WVU and met with a professor before I went, and he actually told me I should take some time off and get serious about life because I was pretty much failing out of high school because I worked all the time. I ran a pizza shop and I really didn't study. And so when he told me that, of course, I was like, screw that, I'm gonna do this. And he motivated me to go to college and do well.
So I didn't know this. So running a pizza shop, was there any, I'm curious, even through that experience, anything that you learned then that's been helpful to you today?
I love Chef's Table, the pizza one that's out now, if you haven't seen it yet. But no, seriously, it's, you learn hard work. In terms of male relationships, my dad was working all the time, so I wasn't around him as much. I had a gentleman there, Frank Davis, who was like a father to me and really taught me a lot about life and just hard work, focus. And I remember though too, like just as an employer now, I went to them at a young age and I said, hey guys, like I'm pretty much running the shop and you should make me a manager. And the response was, I'll either make you a manager or you can get a raise. And I'm like, wait, what do you mean one of the two? I should be getting both. And but it was just my early experiences and it made me work that much harder to earn their respect. And I think there's a lot about life that you learn from something like that.
Which did you pick, the raise or the title?
I took the raise at that time.
Yep.
Yeah, because I had the respect as a leader within the shop. And I mean, I was in high school dating college girls who were cheerleaders, and it was like they all come home for the summer, and I was like, that's what leadership was to me at that time. It's just being kind of the top dog in the room, and it's funny how your perspective is at that time.
So it's interesting, and you're not the first to say this. It's fascinating to me of people who were not the best, let's say, students academically, whether it was through high school or even college, and yet you get to law school and they thrive. Was that the case for you?
Yeah, it's funny. So once it was Professor DeClerico told me, get serious about life. I actually went to WVU and I graded into the honor system. I think I was one of 5 kids out of 20-some thousand that graded into the honor system. So I had to get I had to have a 3.8 average. So I got a 3.6 the first semester, 4 the second semester. I graded into it. And then I was actually proud. I didn't get the Rhodes Scholarship, but Professor DeClerico, who told me to get serious about life, ended up asking me to apply for the Rhodes Scholarship 3 years later. And so, yeah, I took off, and it was that reverse psychology that helped.
It's just fascinating to hear that at some point in your life, you had somebody tell you to get serious about life. It's interesting, right? How we ultimately grow up, you being obviously such a disciplined person today, and maybe that was not always the case. I remember Nick Rowley's on the podcast was sharing a very similar story of just the fact that, he didn't really become as disciplined as he is today until probably late stages of law school.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting. I think there's other things that impacted me. I think, my father gave me a book, The Magic of Thinking Big. And it really taught me to dream, to really look beyond my circumstances. I think I took it to heart. Stories he would tell me, he was a very poor kid in Western Pennsylvania growing up. He used to, have one pair of pants he'd wash each day before he went to school because he just, couldn't afford anything more. He'd collect pop bottles alongside the road and kids would throw stuff at him. I took those stories and internalized them to myself, and I use them to motivate myself at times. And so probably, Michael, I'm sure you could relate to is, that just sort of immigrant journey. I know with Roopal, who's my law partner, very similar. We internalize and we start looking for financial security. And so it really drives you for success. At the same time, I think it can drive you too far. And I certainly have had points in my life that happened, but yeah, it definitely gave me a drive.
So I'm curious. So coming out of law school, you went to a large corporate defense firm and then later moved on to being a prosecutor. What was that journey like?
Yeah. So first of all, I went to law school with the mindset that, okay, great on the law review, do that. And I passed it up because I wanted to try cases. And so I did really well in moot court, and I got invited to be a third-year practice certified intern at the U.S. Attorney's Office. So I tried 3 cases to verdict during my third year of law school. And so coming out, I'm like, okay, where do I go and what can I do? And the Career Services Office is like, well, you're in the top of your class. You got to go to Pittsburgh. That's where you're going to Pittsburgh. You got to go to the best firm. And so I went to Reed Smith, which is the best firm at that time. And I walked in, I'm like, this place is nothing like what I expected it to be or wanted to be. And I just had no frame of reference. But I found my way onto a couple of trial teams, tried some cases. But at some point in time, I found myself working in the labor and employment group. And it turns out one of the attorneys I was working with actually worked on a case that involved my dad. And I didn't know at the time, but my dad growing up, and part of this is on our website, but I'll tell you the full story. Growing up, my dad would take me into like lumber yards and different places with him. And he'd use examples with me of just people like shaking hands and treating everyone with respect and humility. Don't forget where you come from is what he would tell me. One of the stories, he was in a union arbitration where he, as a union worker, was actually in the arbitration and testified. And then afterwards, he went around the room and shook hands with people. And he went to shake hands with this attorney, and the attorney refused to shake his hand. And so he used to use that as an example with me growing up, hey, never be like that. When you become a lawyer, treat people with respect, understand where you came from. And so I ended up at Reed Smith, and I went to do a clerkship, and I came back. And I was working with this lawyer, and one day he came into my office and said, hey, listen, I'm working for the steel mill in West Virginia. We're in West Virginia, which is where you grew up. And I haven't worked with him for years, but I'd like you to go, with me on this and work on it. And I was like, okay. And it dawned on me that the attorney walked with a limp and had a cane. And my dad had told me about the story with the attorney who wouldn't shake his hand. And he told me some attributes physically of the guy, and it was the match with this guy. And so I went back to my dad and I was like, hey, listen, was this person happen to be X person? And he's like, yeah, how did you know that? And it turned out it was the person that I was working with. And so, I get almost tearful thinking about that because when I look back at it now, it's just my heart wasn't aligned with where I was, obviously. And I was trying cases, I was doing things on a level that most second, third year associates at Reed Smith weren't getting to do, but it just didn't sit well with me in terms of a person who I was. From that, I just decided I didn't want to do corporate work, didn't sit well with me. And it works for some people. I have great friends that still do that work and have a lot of respect for it, but it just wasn't who I was as a person.
So then how do you go on to become federal prosecutor? And then what was that experience like?
Yeah, it's great. I have to say, people say that being a federal prosecutor and assistant U.S. attorney is one of the greatest jobs there is. And it's true, particularly in New York City. I went there in 1999 and just had phenomenal trial experience. And the great thing about the U.S. Attorney's Office is that you go and you become a prosecutor who can stand on their feet, argue cases, connect with jurors. the jurors looked much different than how I grew up. I grew up in like very gentrified white West Virginia, went to Brooklyn, New York, where there's a lot of minorities. And I had to learn how to really talk and, become someone a little bit different actually in working with those jurors, which I think is an important life lesson. But then of course, like, you have to know how to write. You actually have to be able to do wiretap applications and explain your proof. And all those early skill building things are really important to me. But probably the thing that impacted me the most was my wife at that time was pregnant with my son, and then 9/11 happened. And we always thought that we would end up back in Pittsburgh. And then after we lived through 9/11, we decided, at the time, Rudy Giuliani, when he was, I will say, in my opinion, insane, we really took to heart what he said and decided to stay in New York and really make a home of it. And so we stay in New York, but I did make my way back to Pittsburgh.
So I don't know that I'd ever asked you this. I'm curious, what was the reasoning behind your decision to start your own firm?
Yeah, I say it's planes and prostitutes. That's the reason why I did. And I came out of the U.S. Attorney's Office and I passed up being a partner at, major law firms. And, at the time we were having an executive coach and her saying to me, like, are you sure you want to do this? And at first I'm like, well, yeah, I do. And, she's like, yeah, the money's one thing. You're passing up a lot to go this other route. But I'm concerned about you. And I was like, what do you mean? She's like, well, you have this passion when you talk about it. Like it's just driving passion that I'm a little concerned you're gonna get burned out. And so it's time. I'm like, yeah, whatever. Like that's all nice, but of course I'm gonna go do this. And I did. I was very idealistic in terms of what I thought a plaintiff's attorney was supposed to be. And ended up with a couple of firms where the values weren't aligned with where I was, but had the good fortune of actually finding someone within those firms, Roopal Luhana, who's my law partner now, who really our values were aligned, and we worked a lot together. And eventually, after just a couple of situations, we had a client where Roopal and I were getting on a plane to fly to Los Angeles to try a case. Literally, we landed in LA, and we got word from one of the partners that it was my client, and without telling the client, the case got settled. And so I'm just like, you know what? Like this is complete bullshit. This isn't the way I want to practice my, my cases and the area of law that I want to practice in. And so we just decided we should start a firm.
What were those values? I'm curious, when you and Roopal met, like what were the values that you were aligned on? Were you a partner person at the time? Like, did you anticipate kind of going that route?
So I was an associate. She was an associate, but she was actually coming right out of law school. And of course, I had the experience I did in terms of big firm clerkship and then federal prosecutor. So I felt like I knew a lot more than I probably did at the time. We were doing a lot of securities fraud litigation at that time. And so we spent a couple of years working together. I became a partner at the firm I was at that time. We actually left and then went to another firm and started up the mass tort practice at the other firm. I remember sitting down with the partners of the second firm, and Roopal was actually expecting with one of her daughters at that time, and them kind of going like, wait, you're bringing her with you? She's expecting. And I'm going like, are you kidding me? This day and age, we're actually having this conversation. And so he's like, yeah, of course I'm vouching for Roopal of all people. Like she's worked harder than most anybody, tremendously hard worker. But yeah, I think for us, it was the values, loyalty, family is really important. Certainly hard work's critically important. And, Roopal's just wickedly smart, really capable person and a great lawyer. So
how would you describe the dynamic between the two of you?
It's interesting. I think we understand the dynamic better, having worked with Crisp and Jess and certainly understanding our print and Colby, for example. But, it's interesting. When we first started, I did a lot of, sort of bigger picture. I would do depositions. Roopal did all the prep for him, did a lot of things like that. And so she's very detail oriented, whereas I was more bigger picture. And of course, loved doing cross examinations. And so that was probably our early on dynamic. And now flip the roles. And, Roopal's in Florida today and this week and next week arguing Daubert motions in the Zantac litigation. My other partner, Pat Booth, trying a case in Pittsburgh right now. And it's been an adjustment for me in a really good way, a very positive way, just to step back and, be able to support them and what they're doing. And, it comes full circle.
And Eric, I know, interestingly enough, we were actually talking about this earlier today. What would you say, just even between the two of you and the firm, have been some of the greatest achievements? So,
we did the denture adhesive litigation. So Super Polygrip, for example, doesn't have zinc any longer. I know we had a hand in that. There are other pieces of that case, like the fixant litigation, which was, we did 14 appeals in that part of the litigation. I like to say the defense attorneys at the time, but also say now it was one of the greatest pro bono projects we've ever done. Because look, if you want to say doing good by doing right, you got to live by it. You got to actually follow that path and walk that walk. And so we do that as a firm. And so we make a conscious decision about what we're going to invest our time and money into. And then we go in and we do it. And that's something I think we're very proud of.
So speaking of which, I know you just mentioned it, doing good by doing right. I guess you could say it's almost like a slogan of the firm today. How did that come to be?
Yeah, I mean, I think initially it was, part of what I said, the planes and prostitutes sort of reaction to that is, that's not who we are. That's not what we wanted to be. You take sort of that old guard sort of view of mass torts and what people are doing. Like, there's just a reaction to that to some degree. With that said, I think that the fuller knowledge from my perspective is just my own personal journey. Having been sexually abused at a young age, someone with a lazy eye at 5, 6 years old, feeling all alone and really wanting to do well by my clients, I wanted to make sure that we didn't get lost at some point in that. And so, just our relationships, among referral partners, among our clients and our communities. I had a situation this week where we had a wrongful death case come into the office. It was a woman who was in an accident. Her husband was killed. She was injured. We went to sign up the case, and it turns out a friend of mine from West Virginia signed the case up over us. He actually got the case and we didn't. I picked up my cell phone. I gave him a call. He's someone I've fished with a ton. We've just been good friends with. And it was actually because the way the client said it, I was like, oh, I hope we weren't getting bad mouth about it. And I knew him. I was like, I don't think that's the case. But what I was really calling for, and he was quite surprised about, is my mom, who is a social worker with our firm, said to me, Eric, when I spoke to this woman, Marge, I'm really concerned because she's obviously very upset at losing her husband. She's really upset right now, and I don't think she has the resources to get the counseling she needs for grieving, and I want to reach back out to her in a couple of weeks. So I was literally calling Jeff to say, hey, Jeff, is it okay with you? You know my mom. Can my mom reach back out to her in a couple of weeks? We're not trying to take the case, not going to step on your toes anyway, but just in a loving, supporting way. And my team, and I think Jeff was taken aback by, not my team wasn't, but Jeff was taken aback by like, wait, you don't have an interest in this? Do you want to actually reach back out to the client? And the answer is yes, it's the right thing to do. And that's really just how we operate as a firm.
And then just the firm as a whole, I mean, there's a single event side to the practice. There's the mass tort side. What's kind of been the allure or the draw, especially to the mass tort side? Because, when you hear about a lot of firms that are, investing in certain mass torts, they're taking a very different approach than you and Roopal do.
Yeah, I think for us, we came into mass torts and had an impact in the industry pretty quickly. And that's something we want to continue. And, I think a lot of firms, on the plaintiff side look at mass torts like, oh, it's just a moneymaker. Here's how I can do an inventory or do whatever. It certainly can be lucrative. It's also very high risk, obviously. And, you can have in a litigation like the denture adhesive litigation where one part's wildly successful, the other part's very difficult. And you have to take your lumps. And certainly if you're true to your values and you press forward and handling cases with the skill and training your team has, you can have an impact. And you can have an impact not just in one case or 10 cases or 100 cases, but literally thousands of people you can impact, and you can impact industries. And that's the lure of it for us.
Yeah, I remember Mike Papantonio would say, like, he'd say, well, instead of focusing on auto accidents, like, why not focus on things where we can actually drive change and change in legislature and change and so on, and really save a whole lot of people. So it's great. It's interesting in the sense that for a lot of mass torts or a lot of lawyers who approach it, they look at it as a moneymaker.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
So, and it's very labor intensive.
Yeah. And I think that's part of the challenge with mass torts generally as a marketplace now is there's so much venture capital coming in and venture capitalists, unfortunately, that's what their focus is. And I think part of, what we grapple with as a firm is, how do we take that and actually use it for good? And I think that's the obligation, and how we can become more professional or bring professionalism to it is to keep an eye on that as mass tort attorneys. And I think that's important.
I want to segue to talking about the client experience, because I know this is something that you all focus on quite heavily, particularly even in the first 100 days, if you could speak to that.
Yeah, it's so we met Joey Coleman through CRISP, obviously, and for us, we started as a national mass tort firm, and then we had the Pittsburgh office, which we opened in 2013, and so we had this high-scaled business, large volume business. Then we went back to like individual cases where we could actually sit down with the clients pre-COVID, obviously, not as much even now, but sit down with the clients individually. And so we looked at it and said, okay, we want to build up in the Pittsburgh office the client journey, client experience, but we also want to extrapolate back out to mass torts. And so certainly those touch points and connections are really important. Our team really feels comfortable with using, a simple iPhone and other things to create videos for our clients. And not just like I see people now using them to chase clients, but it's even staying connected to the clients, using even John Rowland's ideas in terms of like giftology and doing things for clients, like taking all those pieces and kind of baking them together. We now have a client success manager, which is Stacy with our office. Her full-time dedicated position is making sure clients have the best experience. And it takes different skills, hats and utility to do that on mass torts versus in the PI practice. I mean, we just got an automation award for Litify because how we automate in terms of responding to clients, not because we want to make the clients feel like a number through an automation, but instead those touch points.
And I know you mentioned even the client experience. Why is that important to you? Why emphasize that so much?
We could spend hours on this, Michael, but for our clients, we're going to get them a monetary award at the end of the case. If we're able to say, okay, this is a case we want, we know where it's going to go, like that's going to happen. And within a margin, depending on who the lawyer is, it's going to handle that. So then we say, like, what value add can we offer them? And some of it's healing. You know, my mom, who's a social worker, works for our firm as a counselor. And so, as I mentioned already, you know, being able to work with them and have them help them obtain closure in their case is really important. If you're going to seek justice, you have to do justice in the process. And part of that for us, that doing good by doing right, is to actually support the clients in healing. And that healing takes various forms. Some of it's just simply listening to the clients. One of the things I just talked to one of my coaching groups within our firm about recently was Imago relationship therapy, which is literally a marriage counseling sort of therapy, but it's this Imago dialogue, which is reflecting and mirroring and helping people heal as a result. There's other pieces to it, but those pieces that are important to our team. And so just helping them be better listeners with our clients, for example. And so all this to us is really part of this journey. And I think within margins, we can impact the end result, but we can impact them individually on a more significant level.
And on the note of doing good by doing right, so there's obviously doing that for your clients, but that extends also to the community.
It does. Yeah. It's something that I've taken to heart. What Chris has said is, you know, as leaders, we have to work on ourselves and, you know, be able to face outward. And I think once we take care of ourselves individually, then the team members take care of the clients take care of the firm. But then more broadly than that, if you take care of the community also will take care of the firm as well. But if you give with the expectation of receiving, it just doesn't come. So you just have to give wholeheartedly. And for us, you know, that's one of the things I love about going back to Pittsburgh. You know, I said I made it back. It's, opening up the Pittsburgh and West Virginia offices. We've been able to do things like our turkey giveaway. We've been able to go in the community and find people that really are respected in the community, like Najee Harris, for example, and working with Najee to then have an impact on a turkey giveaway or student distracted driving initiatives or supporting the Bigger Picture Foundation and what he's trying to do with his foundation. And so we find these connections with people just because our heart's coming from the right place and their heart's coming from the right place. And people say to me like, well, how is it you're working with Najee Harris? Well, we had an agent we know who put us in contact, but he could have worked with any law firm. He actually aligned in terms of our values. And that to me is just a beautiful thing about life and just builds relationships, which is wonderful.
And for those listening who are either Alabama fans or Pittsburgh Steelers fans, in working with Najee Harris, I'm just curious, had you done anything like that before, or like in working with an athlete or celebrity or something like that?
Yeah, this is the second year. No, we hadn't done that before. And it was actually through Chris, one of the members in the Chris Beck's group had introduced us to an agent, which really started it off. And that's where we got the idea from. But you start thinking about your message and what you're trying to do. And so if we say we want to do good in the community, how can we multiply that impact? You know, we're always thinking about that as leaders and as a firm. And so, you know, being able to align our brand with Najee Harris in a community way is really something that was meaningful to us.
Sorry, I want to shift gears because I'm curious. So during 2020, during COVID, a bunch of us got on this Peloton kick, and maybe even a little bit earlier than that. But by the time we got on board with Peloton, I think you were just getting off the Peloton bike and getting onto a road bike. Now, as a triathlete, have you always been that way, or like was there in terms of like endurance sports and so on, or was there something that led to that?
Yeah, in terms of myself and my journey with Peloton, so I bought the bike in September of 2015, so it's right after it came out, and I had technology issues with it. It wouldn't hook to my internet. It was having issues. And then I went through a separation with my now ex-wife at the time. And so I just needed something like, I started meditating. I was like, okay, spiritually, mentally, I'm starting to like feel more, get in touch with myself, leave behind sort of that plaintiff's lawyer codependency, which I definitely am a recovering codependent. I think a lot of plaintiff's lawyers can relate to that. But, you know, just physically wanting to get active. And so I started hiking and I'm like, okay, well, it's freezing outside. I got to get into something. So Peloton was a natural fit for that. And then I ended up in some Facebook communities, very positive communities. And a friend of mine started a group called Mileage Maniacs, which was just this group that literally just would see how many miles they could record in a month on a Peloton bike in classes. And then ended up doing a day in the studio with a bunch bunch of my friends. We call it the Dirty Dozen. We did 12 classes in a row. And so that group of friends became close friends. And there's a guy, Jeremy Lisnoff, who's a dear friend. And Jeremy had done an Ironman. He'd done an Ironman Lake Placid. And so he's like, hey, we should do this. And so, of course, I'm like, yeah, that sounds pretty cool. But of course, I'm not an athlete. That's what I would say. Because growing up, my dad would be like, oh, there's someone running. Like, what a waste of time. Like, you don't do that. So we started doing some stuff. And I'm like, okay, I'm going to try to do an Ironman. And we signed up for an Ironman. And then Jeremy was up in Lake Placid with his family, and he did a swim. And he messaged me, he's like, yeah, I'm feeling like crap. I'm feeling really sick. And I was like, oh, that sucks. I'm sure you'll be back on your feet soon. And within I think a 7 to 10 day period, he ended up in the hospital. He'd had a number of many strokes. And it turns out that he had a defective heart valve. Even though he was like collegiate Boston University swimmer, he had a heart valve that he didn't know that was defective. And so he ended up having a heart valve replaced. And so then it became him trying to get me to do an Ironman, to me going, hey, dude, we're going to do an Ironman next year. He's like, shit, no, we're not doing that. I was like, yeah, we are. So within 9 months of his open heart surgery, we did Ironman, half Ironman, Eagleman. And that's really what gave me the bug is just, I have trouble doing stuff for myself at times. So doing it for him was much easier. And so, yeah, we got him across that finish line. And then since then, I've done a bunch of them.
What's the draw of those ultra endurance events for you? Because there's obviously a lot of training involved. It's quite painful. Like what is it that attracts you to that?
I think it gives you perspective in life. Part of it initially is like, how far can I go? What can I do? So my first I did the Dirty Dozen for Peloton, but then I did a 163-mile bike race across Indiana. That was my first long distance thing. And then I did the half, and you'll do a flat race. And you're like, okay, I can do that. Now I want to do an elevation race, and I want to go from a half distance to a full. And so you just kind of keep pushing the envelope. And I'm kind of that person. Like I'm always trying to, see what the next level is. I got into fishing, and my ex-wife would say like, oh, you started fishing locally. Now you're fishing 100 miles offshore from Montauk, catching sharks and white marlin. Like that's just who I am as a person. And so that's really the sort of the path I've been in. And I said to you one day, I said I did skydiving, but I set a limit of one time for myself because I just didn't want to run the risk because I knew I'd like it. And of course I do. I didn't want to do it all the time because I don't know that it's healthy to do it all the time. So.
Well, look, you and I spoke about this, but I agree. I've done it once before as well. Once was enough for me. It's one of those things, I don't know, if you run the probability of it, I'm sure it's safe enough, but the fact that you were thrown out of an airplane one time, you landed on the ground, great,
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because I think with skydiving, I'm sure people would say that I'd have to learn about the sport, obviously, and what to do. But it seems like once you've experienced the free fall, it gets a little bit longer, but really what more can you do without getting too risky? And so, unlike an endurance sport where you're like, okay, like I did 70, miles, 70.3. And so, now I'm going to try to bump it up. And what's the training look like? And the training is so different. You can go from, 45 minutes to an hour a day to literally an hour and a half a day during the week. And then weekends might be 5 or 6 hours. And unlike a pro athlete, you don't get to the luxury of like sitting around on the couch, eating healthy food and just completely shutting your body down and trying to be stress-free. You still have kids, you still have, the demands of your law firm you're managing, you still got to try cases, you have all these things you're doing. And so it becomes a lot to juggle. And, and that's a challenge. So that can be kind of fun as well. And, but yeah, it's I know I see an Ironman in your future. So
yeah, well, I'll tell you, with your new partner, it seems with that, I'm curious, the fact that you guys are doing endurance sports together.
It's funny because she and I met obviously after my ex-wife and I had been separated and stuff for a good while. We ended up meeting on a dating app of all things. When we first exchanged messages, she was like, oh, if nothing else, we'll at least have a running buddy. And we joke about it. But yeah, it definitely drew us together. She's done some halves with me. I think the luxury of being my age and, maybe forming a new life partner is, you get to pick people with those common interests because my ex-wife I met at 20 years old and I'm a much different person now than I was, when I was 20. And so it's something Helen and I really enjoyed. We enjoy traveling together. We certainly enjoy endurance racing and sports. We run together regularly. We bike together regularly. I got her into swimming more recently, although she swam some as a kid. So yeah, it's pretty cool. It's fun.
So Eric, how do you define success?
Success, I think for me, at least personally, is, finding happiness. And it's not just finding happiness like people would say generally, like, oh, I enjoy this sport or doing whatever. I think it's more so looking at yourself and saying, what is holding me back in life? And what is it that can rob me of my joy at any given time? and figuring out what that is and being honest with yourself and actually facing those issues and then working through them. What gave me the courage to even talk publicly and saying I was sexually abused at a young age was, I went through therapy to work on that, EMDR therapy, which is really painful to do. But, there's other things like, doing the glass walk with you and others and Crisp and be able to stand up in front of a group and say, hey, this is what happened to me and speak freely about it. You let go of those things and makes you a more complete person, a happier person. That's success. Like to me, like that's living life, and got incredibly other things that I've done. But at the end of the day, like the things that are most meaningful to me is to actually resolve those things and be able to move forward, and see what's next and love life.
Do you think there's any parallels? I'm just curious when you think about the endurance sports and just being able to there's some aspect I feel to just suffering in general, whether it's meditative, whether it almost forces you to kind of work through things that you have to work through, whether it's physical, mental, or what have you. Do you ever see any parallels between all those?
On a personal level, definitely, and certainly many others I've seen on different journeys, absolutely. We've talked about it, and certainly in your podcast, you've talked about it, Michael. It's just people in the face of their greatest adversity comes change, right? That's what when they have their greatest change. And so if you think about that, if you're out suffering, working through, you're on the last 3 miles or 5 miles of an Ironman, there's a lot of suffering there. And then, there's a lot of clarity that comes with it as well. Some of us, you look at it and you say, God, if I can get through that, I can get through a lot of other things. And you can also leave a lot behind out there on the course as well. So
to take this further, it seems like the communities that are established between those, whether it's between triathletes or even between people riding Peloton bikes and so on, it's interesting in a way that it seems like you've almost rejected the traditional law firm community of just like traditional lawyers. I mean, I know you were talking about earlier of planes and prostitutes and that whole thing is just kind of rejecting that. What do you see as the future of the legal profession?
We're at a constellation where, between a Me Too movement and, what's going on with like Black Lives Matter, but then also what's going on in terms of like the changing of our industry and see what's going on in Arizona, for example. And, I think the successful people, the true game changers, the people that are really going to be doing things out there is taking those and figuring out the right mixture to motivate people to build a culture at their firms that can make a difference. You and I have talked about, the generations coming through. They don't just want a paycheck. They truly want to have a cause. And I think there's an incredible opportunity. And it's, is it more sensitive? Yes. I mean, my father is someone that on his deathbed said to me, looked at me, I was tearful. I was like, don't give me that emotional bullshit, right? Like I carried that with me for a while, it's like, well, wait a second. Like, is that—
He said that on his deathbed?
He did.
Oh,
yeah.
that's great.
Yeah. It was within about 10 days of him passing away, which is tough. And, at the time I took it in much differently than, him just, being who he was and what he was dealing with. But, when I look at that in that situation, like I don't want to be that way with my son at the point that I'm passing away, if I have a good fortune of saying goodbye at that time. This is where I think we're more evolved. And, and I think that, I'm a very big believer of Brene Brown saying, vulnerability is a superpower and obviously it has to be used judiciously and not just people. I tell my team all the time, we have to be empathetic and compassionate with our clients. We have to turn up and that's important. But being able to be vulnerable, I think is equally as important. It takes courage. And I think that, the two together can be really powerful.
So Eric, as we come to a close, this being the Game Changing Attorney podcast, what does being a game changer mean to you?
The courage to challenge the status quo. I think there's a lot of people who see, like the changes in our industry, for example, but what are they actually doing about it? Do they have the courage to actually embrace what's happening and to make a difference in the movement, or do they step back and just be on the sidelines? Yeah, it's just the courage to challenge and see where the market's going and actually affecting the status quo, I think is really what it means to be a game changer.